The day had started like any other on Novaterra, the human colony nestled on the edge of the galaxy. The bustling cities hummed with life, the markets teemed with activity, and the skies above were a soft, clear blue. Yet that morning, something was different. At first, it was a subtle disturbance, shadows flitting across the clouds. A few residents glanced up, dismissing it as an atmospheric anomaly. But then the ground trembled. It was like a distant rumble, deep in the planet's crust. Soon, the sky darkened with something unnatural. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped by several degrees. The first explosion came without warning. A massive flash lit up the horizon, followed by a sound that could only be described as the roar of a thunderstorm mixed with the crash of 1,000 waterfalls. People screamed as debris rained down from above. Panic swept through the streets. Vehicles skidded to a halt. People dropped everything and began running, not sure where to go or what was happening. But the one thing they all knew was that this was no natural disaster. They were under attack. High above, in orbit, the Valkyrie fleet descended like locusts, their enormous warships blotting out the sun. Each ship was a gargantuan testament to their technological might. Sleek, black, and menacing, with weapons that looked more like ancient instruments of war than anything humans had ever seen. The Valkyrie were known across the galaxy for their ruthlessness and their ability to obliterate entire civilizations with ease. And now, they had come for Novaterra. On the ground, Captain Ilara Grant, leader of the Human Defense Forces, stood in shock for only a moment. The familiar sound of her comm unit crackling to life snapped her out of it. A voice, strained with panic, flooded her ears. "Captain, the radar shows multiple incoming vessels. They're massive. This isn't a raid. This is an invasion." Ilara's pulse quickened. She had been prepared for some kind of conflict, but nothing like this. The Valkyrie had a reputation for swift and overwhelming strikes, but they had never come this far out. She tightened her grip on the communicator. "Get everyone underground," she ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through the panic around her. "We need to buy time. Evacuate the civilians, move the fleet to defensive positions, and contact command. We're going to need every ship we've got." She looked up at the sky, her eyes narrowing as the first wave of Valkyrie warships opened fire. Blinding beams of energy lashed out, tearing apart everything they touched. The ground trembled with each blast, sending shockwaves through the city. Buildings crumbled, and fires erupted in every direction. For a moment, Ilara stood frozen, watching the destruction unfold. The Valkyrie weren't here to negotiate or conquer. They were here to annihilate. "We can't fight them head-on," Ilara muttered under her breath. Not like this. The human fleet was outnumbered, their ships smaller and weaker compared to the Valkyrie juggernauts. They had their share of advanced technology, but nothing that could withstand the sheer destructive force of the alien invaders. "Captain," a voice crackled through her earpiece again, this time from Lieutenant Martin, a trusted officer on her team. "We've got a small fleet moving to intercept, but it won't be enough. We need a plan, and fast." Ilara's mind raced. In every training simulation, in every strategic exercise, she had prepared for enemy invasions, but nothing had ever truly felt real. This was different. The Valkyrie were here, and they didn't just want Novaterra. They wanted to break humanity, to crush it underfoot. But one thing the Valkyrie hadn't counted on was the human spirit. "We'll hold them off as long as we can," she said, her voice steady now, despite the chaos around her. "But we're not just going to survive. We're going to make them regret ever coming here." Ilara turned to her officers, her eyes hardening with resolve. "Get the civilians to shelter. Activate the emergency defenses. And if we have to, we fight back with everything we've got." As her team scattered to carry out their orders, Ilara took one last look at the devastation above. The Valkyrie were here, and they were bringing hell with them. But she wasn't about to let them take Nova Terra without a fight. The sky above Nova Terra was ablaze, streaked with flashes of energy beams that cut through the atmosphere like knives through butter. The first wave of Valkyrie warships had begun their assault with brutal efficiency. They were not here for conquest or negotiation. They were here to erase humanity from the galaxy. Captain Elara Grant stood on the shattered command deck of the Solstice, the flagship of the human defense fleet. Her hands gripped the edge of a console, steadying herself against the violent tremors shaking the ship. Her eyes were fixed on the holoscreen in front of her, which displayed the chaos unfolding above their planet. The Valkyrie fleet had already obliterated several outposts, and the human forces were scattered across the planet, attempting to mount a defense that felt increasingly futile. The Solstice had been their last line of defense, but it was clear that it was only a matter of time before the massive Valkyrie ships tore through it as easily as they had destroyed the surface cities. "Captain," a voice broke her focus. Lieutenant Martin, his face pale, stepped forward. "We've lost contact with the northern defense perimeter. The enemy is pushing forward too fast. Our ships, they're getting overwhelmed." Elara's jaw tightened. She had seen this happen before in simulations. Brutal, unrelenting enemy forces that overpowered even the best laid plans. But this was real. The human fleet was outclassed. The Valkyries' advanced weaponry and sheer numbers had turned their offensive into a slaughter. "We need to pull back," Martin said, his voice laced with desperation. "We can't win this fight head-on. If we retreat, we might save what's left of the fleet." Elara shook her head, refusing to even entertain the idea. "We don't retreat. We hold our ground. Get our smaller ships in position to intercept. Keep the civilians safe." "Captain, we're outmatched." The Valkyrie. "I said no," Elara interrupted sharply. She turned to face the display again. "We'll fight them until every last ship is gone. If we die today, we die fighting." A tense silence fell over the bridge. No one spoke, but their faces told the same story. Fear mixed with the stubborn resolve to keep going. They had come so far, and they weren't going to let it all fall apart now. Elara's thoughts raced, trying to think of any way to shift the balance, to find some glimmer of hope amid the devastation. The Valkyrie's assault was so precise, so well coordinated that any human counterattack had been reduced to desperate skirmishes. But there had to be a way. There had to be something the humans could do. She glanced at the holo display again. Her gaze lingered on one of the Valkyrie ships, its massive form looming in space, firing beams of concentrated energy at the planet below. It was one of the Kairos-class dreadnoughts, the flagship of the Valkyrie invasion force. If they could somehow neutralize that ship, perhaps the rest of the fleet would falter. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice now calm but filled with determination, "I want every available fighter squadron to target that dreadnought. We'll go after its weak points, its thrusters and shield generators. If we can take it down, we may be able to slow the Valkyrie advance." Martin hesitated. "That ship is a fortress, Captain. A single squadron won't." "I know," she said, "but it's the only chance we have. We won't know unless we try." Orders were quickly relayed, and within moments, the fighter pilots aboard the Solstice were assembling. A wave of tension filled the bridge as Elara watched the ships prepare to launch, knowing they were going up against something far beyond their capabilities. "Captain, we've got incoming," the comms officer warned, her voice tight with fear. A second wave of Valkyrie ships, bigger than the first. Elara's heart sank, even as her fleet prepared for the fight of their lives. Reinforcements for the Valkyrie were already arriving. The situation was spiraling beyond her control, and the weight of their imminent defeat pressed down on her like a storm. "Take the shot," Elara ordered. The fighter squadron blasted off from the Solstice, a final defiant roar of engines as they soared into the battle. But the moment they reached the Valkyrie dreadnought's proximity, something unexpected happened. One of the smaller ships in the fleet, barely equipped for a full-on fight, managed to get a few hits on the dreadnought's outer shielding. It wasn't much, just a few sparks and the tiniest crack in the armor. But it was enough to make the Valkyrie ships notice. They weren't finished yet. In that brief moment of vulnerability, Ilara's mind raced. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. The Valkyrie weren't invincible. If the humans could use their creativity, their fearlessness, they might just have a fighting chance. The sounds of battle outside the solstice were deafening. The human fighters that had launched to take on the Valkyrie dreadnought had been torn to pieces by overwhelming firepower. However, in the chaos, something unexpected happened. As the Valkyrie dreadnought's shields flickered and sparked, a small human ship, an old underfunded freighter that had been repurposed for military use, had managed to slip through the gaps in the Valkyrie defenses. Its hull was battered, barely holding together, but its weapon systems, retrofitted with the remnants of human tech, had somehow managed to breach the dreadnought's outer shields. The dreadnought's shields weren't invulnerable after all. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that something had changed. "Captain," Lieutenant Martin's voice crackled through the comms. "We've got a targetable weak point on the dreadnought's aft section. It's exposed, just long enough to make a strike." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. This was their moment. The dreadnought had always seemed like an untouchable fortress, a ship designed to be invincible, but now there was a crack in its armor. "Focus all fire on that weak point," Ilara ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. "If we can hit it before the Valkyrie can reinforce the shield, we might have a chance." The human fleet, despite its numerical disadvantage, rallied around the command. Fighters that had been damaged in previous skirmishes were now reorganized, and the battered ships of the fleet surged forward, targeting the newly exposed weak spot. The Solstice fired its heavy cannons, joining in the assault with a barrage of precision shots aimed at the vulnerable area. A few other ships in the fleet followed suit, and within moments, the crack in the dreadnought's shielding widened. The dreadnought shuddered under the sustained barrage, and for the first time, a series of alarms blared from the Valkyrie ship's bridge, signaling a breach. But the Valkyrie weren't going to give up easily. Their shields flickered back to full power, but it was too late. The damage had been done. One final, coordinated strike from the human fleet, including the Vengeful Rebirth, a newly refitted ship with salvaged alien tech, hammered into the dreadnought's exposed core. The ship groaned, then exploded in a burst of energy, sending a shockwave through space. The force of the blast shook nearby ships, and the human fleet watched in stunned silence as the Valkyrie flagship disintegrated in a spectacular fireball. For a brief moment, the battlefield went still. The Valkyrie ships, caught off guard by the unexpected strike, were thrown into disarray. The remaining Valkyrie ships attempted to regroup, but their morale had already shattered. The Valkyrie had been known for their ruthless efficiency, but they had underestimated one thing: human tenacity. "We did it," Martin whispered over the comms, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. Ilara stood motionless for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the wreckage of the dreadnought. She knew this victory was a temporary one. A single battle in a war that was far from over, but it was a victory nonetheless. It had shown that the Valkyrie weren't invincible, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity could adapt and strike back. But there was no time to rest. The remaining Valkyrie ships were already moving to avenge their fallen flagship, their weapons charging for another assault. The battle was far from won, and Ilara knew that this moment of triumph wouldn't last long unless they took full advantage of it. "Prepare for the next wave," Ilara said, her voice steady and commanding. "We hit them hard when they least expect it." Her mind was already racing, formulating plans and strategies. The tide had turned for the first time in this battle, but this small victory would only matter if the humans could seize the initiative. If they faltered now, the Valkyrie would crush them completely. "Lieutenant Martin," she continued, "get me a status update on the fleet, and get the engineers to work. We'll need every weapon we can muster." The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The destruction of the Valkyrie dreadnought had given the human fleet a much-needed morale boost, But Elara Grant knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Valkyrie were ruthless, and this victory, while significant, was only the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a long, grueling battle. But amidst the chaos, an unexpected opportunity had emerged, one that could change the course of the war. After the explosion of the dreadnought, several pieces of wreckage drifted toward the lower orbit, and one chunk of debris in particular stood out. It wasn't just any random piece of a destroyed ship, it was part of the hull of the Valkyrie flagship, and buried inside its shattered structure was something valuable, something that could turn the tide in humanity's favor. Elara paced across the command deck of the Solstice, her mind racing. The engineers on board had already started to comb through the wreckage, but they needed more time and more hands. She couldn't afford to waste this chance. The human fleet had never been stronger than when they fought with their backs against the wall, but they still lacked the firepower to defeat the Valkyrie in open combat. What they needed now was an advantage, and the wreckage could hold the key. Elara, we're getting strange readings, Chief Engineer Holden reported, his voice echoing through the comms. It's not just debris. We've found intact Valkyrie tech. Some of it looks new, unfamiliar. New tech? Elara asked, her curiosity piqued. The Valkyrie's technology had been advanced, incomprehensible to human engineers at first glance. If there was a way to adapt it, it could give them the edge they desperately needed. We're talking about weapon systems that could be retrofitted, Holden continued. I'm sending a team to recover what we can. But we'll need time, Elara. Elara thought for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She could no longer afford to wait. The Valkyrie would regroup, and their counterattacks would be even more devastating. They needed this technology now, and the best way to access it was to go directly to the heart of the wreckage. I'll go with you, Elara decided, her voice firm. We don't have time to wait for another plan. If we can make use of even a fraction of what we find, it could turn the war in our favor. Lieutenant Martin was at her side within seconds. Captain, are you sure about this? It's too dangerous. If the Valkyrie detect. I'm sure, Elara interrupted, her gaze hard. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. We're going to do whatever it takes to win. The two of them, along with a handful of elite engineers and tech specialists, boarded a smaller shuttle, outfitted with a defensive shield and enough firepower to ward off any Valkyrie patrols. They shot toward the wreckage, and Elara felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Every minute counted. They couldn't afford to be discovered. As they approached the massive piece of the dreadnought's wreckage, Elara's eyes widened. The ship's twisted form loomed like a broken titan in space. Sections of it were still glowing faintly with residual energy, a reminder of how dangerous the Valkyrie's tech truly was. Ready to board, Martin said, his voice steady. We'll be in and out before they notice. Elara nodded and led the team into the heart of the wreckage. The inside of the Valkyrie ship was as alien as anything she had ever seen. Surfaces sleek and dark, with glowing lines of light pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. But there was no time for awe. They had a mission, and it was one that could decide the fate of their entire species. Focus on anything we can use, Elara ordered. Weapons, propulsion systems, anything that can give us an edge. The engineers worked quickly, pulling apart panels and accessing alien technology with a combination of human ingenuity and brute force. There were strange devices that no one could identify, but the tools at their disposal were quickly adapted to strip them down for salvageable components. Meanwhile, Elara kept her eyes on the damaged systems, trying to understand the technology that had once made the dreadnought nearly unstoppable. Time seemed to blur as they worked. The wreckage, despite being in a state of ruin, seemed to pulse with an eerie alien energy. But there was no turning back now. Each second spent here was a risk, but each piece of technology they managed to secure could be the key to their survival. Captain, Holden called, his voice breaking through her focus. I think we found something. It's a weapon system, some sort of energy cannon. If we can reverse engineer this, it could amplify our current tech. Ilara moved toward him, her heart racing. If they could replicate this technology, it might give them a fighting chance, an equalizer in the war. How long? She asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Hours, maybe less, Holden said. But we can't do it here. We need to get back to the solstice before we're detected. Ilara nodded, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, humanity had a tangible weapon, something they could use to strike back at the Varkari, with a power they had never dreamed possible. Let's go, she said. We've got a fight to win. The shuttle streaked through the void, returning to the solstice with the salvage team and their precious cargo. Ilara Grant stood at the front of the shuttle, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead, her mind racing with possibilities. The Varkari weapon system they had just extracted from the wreckage was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The technology was incomprehensible, but there was something undeniably powerful about it. If they could make it work, it would give them the firepower they desperately needed. Inside the solstice, the engineering team worked furiously to reverse engineer the alien tech. Ilara had no illusions. It wouldn't be easy. The Varkari systems were so advanced that they couldn't simply plug and play. But they had no choice. Their fleet was running out of options, and they couldn't afford to wait. We've got the pieces, Chief Engineer Holden said, his voice tight with tension as he examined the alien components. But it's going to take time to integrate this into our systems. The power requirements alone are off the charts. Ilara clenched her fists. Time was the one thing they didn't have. The Varkari fleet was regrouping, and their next strike would likely be aimed directly at the heart of the human resistance. How long? Holden hesitated, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. At best, a few hours to get a working prototype. But we need to be cautious. One wrong move, and it could backfire. Ilara's eyes flicked toward the viewport, where the remaining Varkari ships were drifting in the distance, regrouping. She had no time to wait for perfection. They had already stolen a moment of victory, and now they needed to capitalize on it. We don't have hours, Ilara said, her voice resolute. We'll take the prototype. I'll lead a small strike team. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we fight with what we have. Martin, who had been standing beside her, nodded grimly. Understood, Captain. But if the Varkari detect us leaving the solstice, we'll keep a low profile, Ilara interrupted. Get the prototype ready. We'll go in fast, hit them hard, and get back before they can retaliate. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The crew knew that what they were about to attempt was reckless, dangerous, and, if unsuccessful, could be their undoing. But Ilara saw no other choice. The Varkari would stop at nothing to eradicate humanity, and this was their chance to strike a serious blow. As the prototype weapon was mounted to the shuttle, the crew prepped for the assault. Ilara's mind whirred with calculations. What if it malfunctioned? What if they couldn't get close enough? But there was no room for doubt. They had to make it work. The small strike force boarded the shuttle, and within minutes they were flying through space once again, heading toward the Varkari fleet. The plan was simple: infiltrate, strike, and get out. The key to success would be speed, catch the Varkari off guard, and then retreat before they could mount a proper defense. The Solstice and the rest of the human fleet remained in a defensive posture, prepared to provide cover, but Ilara knew they couldn't rely solely on the fleet. This was about precision. The prototype weapon, designed to amplify the power of the human fleet's cannons, could potentially disable a Varkari ship with a single shot. The stakes couldn't be higher. As the shuttle approached the first of the Varkari ships, Ilara's grip tightened on the controls. Her pulse raced with adrenaline, her mind sharpened by the knowledge that their survival depended on the success of this mission. The Varkari ships were formidable, but with their new weapon, humanity had a chance to level the playing field. "Stand by," she ordered her crew, her voice steady despite the intensity of the situation. "We're going in." The shuttle moved swiftly, weaving between Valkyrie warships. The vastness of space was a battlefield in itself, and Ilara's heart pounded as they neared the target. Her breath slowed, focusing on the mission ahead. One strike, one opportunity. As the shuttle positioned itself in optimal firing range, the hum of the weapon activated. The prototype vibrated with energy, and Ilara's eyes locked onto the target. The Valkyrie ship, one of their largest remaining vessels, loomed before them, its weapons charging. Now, Ilara commanded. The weapon fired, and the results were immediate. A brilliant beam of concentrated energy shot from the shuttle, striking the Valkyrie ship with a force that rattled the very fabric of space. For a moment, there was nothing but silence as the beam tore into the Valkyrie vessel's hull. Then the ship exploded, its massive form breaking apart into 1,000 pieces. The shockwave hit the shuttle, knocking it off course. But Ilara quickly regained control. The Valkyrie ship had been destroyed in a single shot. The human crew cheered, a wave of relief washing over them. But Ilara knew this was far from over. Their strike had been successful, but the Valkyrie were far from finished. "Return to the solstice," Ilara ordered, voice hard with determination. "We've got a fight to finish." The shockwave from the destroyed Valkyrie warship rippled through space, and for a moment, it seemed as though the tide of the battle had finally turned in humanity's favor. Ilara Grant's heart still raced from the adrenaline, but she knew better than to celebrate prematurely. The Valkyrie were relentless, and they would not take this defeat lying down. As the shuttle made its way back to the solstice, Ilara's mind was already focused on what came next. The weapon had worked, but it had only taken down one ship. The Valkyrie fleet was vast, and there were many more where that came from. They needed to exploit this moment of weakness, but time was running out. "Captain, we've got incoming." Lieutenant Martin's voice broke through the tension. "Valkyrie ships are moving to intercept us." Ilara's eyes narrowed. It was as she feared. The Valkyrie were quick to regroup, and they were not going to let one of their ships go down without retaliation. Their ships were already reorganizing and bearing down on the human fleet, ready to strike with a vengeance. "Bring us in faster, Lieutenant," Ilara ordered, gripping the armrest of her seat. "We need to get back to the solstice and warn the others." As the shuttle rocketed toward the flagship, Ilara's mind raced. The Valkyrie had been caught off guard, yes, but now they were likely preparing for their most devastating counterattack yet. And they had the numbers. The human fleet had been damaged during the earlier assault, and even with the new weapon, they were still outmatched in terms of sheer firepower and ships. "Status update on the fleet," Ilara asked, her voice sharp as she glanced at the tactical display. "We've lost communication with 3 of our remaining ships," Martin replied, his voice tight. "And the Valkyrie are moving in fast. If we don't act quickly, we'll be overwhelmed." Ilara's stomach clenched. The loss of those ships meant that the Valkyrie were closing in, and without reinforcements, the human forces would be scattered. But she couldn't afford to retreat. Not now. "We can't give them the chance to regroup fully," Ilara said, her voice steely. "Prepare all remaining fighters. We're going to hit them with everything we have." Within minutes, the solstice was a hive of activity, its crew scrambling to prepare for the next wave of battle. Fighters launched from the base, and the remaining human ships began to form a defensive perimeter, their weapons charged and ready. "Captain, I've got eyes on a Valkyrie battle group," the comms officer reported, her voice steady despite the tension. "They're coming in fast. 5 ships, all heavily armed. They've got us surrounded." Ilara's eyes flicked to the tactical display. The Valkyrie battle group was a force to be reckoned with. These ships were some of the most advanced the enemy had, and their weapons would tear through the human fleet if they weren't careful. "We need to keep their attention on us," Ilara said, her mind working quickly. "Once they're focused on the solstice, we'll send our remaining fighters in for a surprise strike on their engines. Hit them where it hurts, then get out before they can retaliate." The plan was risky, but it was their best shot at turning the battle in their favor. The Valkyrie were organized, but they weren't infallible. The key would be to exploit their overconfidence, to strike when they thought they had the upper hand. As the first Valkyrie ships closed in, Ilara gritted her teeth and watched the enemy vessels grow larger on the display. The tension on the bridge was palpable. Every crew member knew what was at stake. "Prepare to fire," Ilara ordered, her voice unwavering. "Let's give them a reminder of who they're dealing with." The Solstice's weapons powered up, and the bridge hummed with energy. Ilara's pulse quickened as she watched the Valkyrie ships approach. She could feel the weight of every decision, every shot that would soon be fired. Then, without warning, the first volley of Valkyrie fire streaked toward them, and the Solstice rocked violently. Shields flared as the ship absorbed the incoming blasts, but the impact was still felt throughout the vessel. Ilara's grip tightened on the console as the ship groaned under the strain. "Return fire," Ilara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The human fleet retaliated with a barrage of missiles and energy blasts, creating a wall of fire that collided with the Valkyrie ships. The battle was on. The Solstice's cannons roared as they unleashed everything they had, striking the lead Valkyrie ship and sending it into a tailspin. But even as the human fleet gained ground, the Valkyrie weren't backing down. Their ships began to retaliate with brutal force, their weapons slicing through the human defenses like a hot knife through butter. "We can't hold them for much longer," the comms officer called out. "We need to take out their flagship. Now." Ilara's mind snapped into focus. The Valkyrie flagship, their most dangerous weapon, was at the heart of the battle. If they could bring it down, the rest of the fleet would fall into disarray. But to do that, they would need to get close. Too close. "We're going in," Ilara said, her voice firm with resolve. "Prepare for a direct assault." The Solstice broke through the enemy lines, charging straight toward the Valkyrie flagship. The crew's hearts raced, knowing this was their last chance to turn the battle in their favor. The Solstice hurtled through space, its engines roaring as it broke through the chaos of the battlefield, a lone spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the Valkyrie fleet. Ilara Grant's grip tightened on the helm as she navigated the Solstice through the flurry of explosions, debris, and the flashing lights of enemy fire. The ship shuddered under the impact of a glancing blow, but Ilara's focus never wavered. They had no choice but to charge forward. If they could destroy the Valkyrie flagship, the rest of the fleet would crumble. But if they failed, the consequences were too dire to consider. Shields holding at 60%, Lieutenant Martin's voice came through the comms, urgent and steady. "We're taking heavy fire, Captain. They're targeting our engines." "We're not stopping now," Ilara said, her voice resolute. She barely noticed the tremors that rattled the ship, her attention focused entirely on the task at hand. "Get us close to that flagship. We're going for the bridge." The Solstice plunged into the heart of the enemy formation, its weapons firing relentlessly as the crew worked in unison, fighting back the Valkyrie ships that were swarming like angry hornets. Fighters darted around the larger ships, zipping in and out of enemy fire, while the human fleet created a protective perimeter around the Solstice, doing everything they could to shield their command vessel from the overwhelming Valkyrie retaliation. Ilara's eyes were fixed on the massive Valkyrie flagship. It loomed ahead, a dark monolith of alien technology, its weapons already charging for another devastating volley. If they didn't act fast, it would tear through the human fleet, leaving them scattered and defenseless. "Ready the weapon," Ilara commanded. The prototype energy cannon they had salvaged from the wreckage was powered up and locked onto the Valkyrie flagship's bridge. "We've got one shot at this," Chief Engineer Holden's voice crackled over the comms. "If the targeting system aligns, we can hit the heart of the flagship. But we need to get in closer." The Solstice plunged deeper into enemy territory, narrowly dodging incoming fire. Ilara's pulse raced as the Valkyrie ships loomed larger, their weapons flashing. The massive Valkyrie flagship moved ahead, its weapons aimed straight at them. A massive beam of energy erupted from it, and the solstice rocked violently under the impact, sending everyone tumbling. "Shields at 40%. Martin shouted, but Ilara refused to flinch. Every part of her being was honed on the objective. The solstice swerved, its engines screaming as it dove under another burst of fire. The enemy flagship's weapons flared again, but this time, Ilara had a different plan. "Now!" Ilara ordered, and the ship fired the prototype energy cannon. A brilliant beam of light shot forward, cutting through the void toward the Valkyrie flagship. The shot struck the flagship's forward shields with blinding intensity, a massive explosion of light as the energy pulsed across the hull. For a brief moment, Ilara thought they had failed. The flagship's shields had absorbed the attack. But then, the shields flickered, and with a violent jolt, the ship's central core erupted, sending a shockwave across the battlefield. "Direct hit, Captain, it's going down," Martin yelled, his voice a mix of disbelief and awe. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as the Valkyrie flagship began to disintegrate. The massive ship shuddered, its engines erupting in flames, its hull collapsing inward. A series of secondary explosions erupted as the flagship was torn apart from the inside out. The shockwave from the destruction reverberated through space, throwing nearby ships off course. But the battle wasn't over. As the flagship began its fiery descent into oblivion, the Valkyrie fleet seemed to hesitate for just a moment. The human fleet, emboldened by their success, pushed forward, taking advantage of the momentary confusion to launch a counteroffensive. "Push them back," Ilara roared, her voice carrying over the comms as the remaining ships fired relentlessly on the disoriented Valkyrie vessels. "Now's our chance." The human fleet surged forward, fighters weaving in and out of the Valkyrie formations, picking off stragglers and disabling enemy ships one by one. The Valkyrie had lost their heart, their flagship, and their unity was beginning to crumble. The human fighters, emboldened by their success and the morale boost from taking down the Valkyrie symbol of power, attacked with a renewed ferocity. But Ilara wasn't going to let up yet. She knew the Valkyrie would be regrouping, and even though they had shattered their flagship, the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Lieutenant Martin, prepare the fleet for a full-scale assault," Ilara ordered. "We're not giving them time to recover. We hit them now, before they can regroup." "Understood," Martin replied, his voice steady with the confidence that had come from years of fighting together. "All ships are ready." The solstice surged forward once again, and Ilara felt a surge of determination. The Valkyrie were formidable, but they had just witnessed a glimpse of what humanity could do when cornered, when faced with extinction, and how, in the face of such dire odds, they could rise up and strike back. This battle was theirs. But the war? The war was far from over. The solstice soared through the debris of the destroyed Valkyrie flagship, the massive wreckage now floating in pieces like a shattered monument to their victory. Ilara Grant's heart still raced from the intensity of the battle, but there was no time to relax. The human fleet had struck a devastating blow, but the war was far from over. "We've pushed them back for now, but this isn't the end," Ilara muttered to herself, watching the battlefield unfold before her on the tactical display. The remaining Valkyrie ships were retreating, their formation fractured and chaotic. They had been caught off guard, disoriented by the loss of their flagship, but Ilara knew the enemy would regroup and retaliate. "Captain, incoming transmission from the fleet," Lieutenant Martin called from his console. "It's Admiral Solis." Ilara took a deep breath. The battle had been brutal, but the result was undeniable. The Valkyrie were in disarray, but a swift counterattack could very well shift the momentum back in their favor. The Admiral's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain Grant, I've been monitoring the situation. We've sustained heavy losses, but your strike against their flagship has given us the opening we needed. We've disabled the Valkyrie ships in our vicinity and secured the area for now. The fleet is moving to re-establish communications and begin repairs." Ilara nodded grimly, though she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. "Understood, Admiral. What's the next move?" "We've got to keep the pressure on. If we give them time to regroup, they'll retaliate with everything they've got. We're going to hit them while they're still off balance. But we need every available ship. You've already proven that humanity can stand up to them. Now we show them that we can win this." The message was clear. It was time to take the fight to the Valkyrie, to press their advantage before the enemy could recover. "Let's finish this," Ilara said, her voice sharp and determined. She turned to her crew, the faces of those who had fought beside her glowing with newfound hope. "Prepare the fleet for the next phase. We're going on the offensive." The Solstice and the remaining human ships rallied quickly. The once scattered fleet had begun to regroup, each vessel carefully coordinated for the next phase of the assault. The plan was audacious. The Valkyrie fleet still outnumbered them, but they no longer held the upper hand. Humanity had shown it could land a decisive blow. Now, it was time to take the fight deeper into enemy territory. Ilara's mind raced as the Solstice aligned itself with the rest of the human forces. They had to strike hard and fast, before the Valkyrie could reorganize. The Valkyrie were an empire of conquerors, but they had never faced humanity's sheer tenacity, their willingness to fight to the bitter end. As the Solstice moved into formation with the rest of the fleet, Ilara took a moment to breathe, to let the enormity of what had just happened sink in. It wasn't just a victory. It was a symbol. The humans were no longer the underdogs in this war. They had stolen a moment of hope and turned it into a weapon. The comms officer's voice cut through her thoughts, urgent but hopeful. "Captain, we've got a fleet of Valkyrie ships moving toward us. It's a concentrated force. They're coming to retaliate." Ilara's eyes narrowed. The Valkyrie were not going to let this go. But that only made her more certain. If humanity was going to survive, if they were ever going to reclaim their place in the stars, they couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. "Prepare for battle," Ilara ordered, her voice steady. "This is where we show them that we're not just a thorn in their side. We are the future." The human fleet, bolstered by the courage and resolve of every crew member, charged toward the incoming Valkyrie force. The Solstice took point, its cannons firing relentlessly as it closed the distance with the enemy ships. Behind them, the rest of the fleet followed, fighters launching from the bays and weaving through space like a swarm of vengeful hornets. As the two fleets collided, Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment of truth. The Valkyrie were formidable, but they were no longer the invincible force they had once seemed. The humans had proven that. Now, they would prove it again. For the first time, Ilara didn't just feel the weight of command. She felt the hope of every single human who had fought and died to make this moment possible. The hope that, against all odds, they could win. The battle raged on, but one thing was clear. The Valkyrie had underestimated humanity, and now they would learn what it meant to face an enemy that refused to surrender. Humanity had found its place in the stars, and the universe would never be the same again.